All right. We are here with Phil Carter. Phil is a friend of mine now I can call, and my former manager from the time I used to work at Quizlet. He's been a great advisor to a lot of the things that I've been doing in my life, in my business. And when I heard some story that you shared on Adam Fishman's podcast, I thought it's actually a great fit for our podcast too and for our audience, given all the great conversations we shared in our one on ones and all the friendly calls and snowboarding trips that we had together. Given all of that, I thought, why not? Let's bring one of those fun, great conversations here too. So, welcome to the show, Phil.
Thanks for having me, Ali. And the feeling's mutual. Dear friend, and glad that we're getting to do this.
Awesome. So, I just want to set the stage and help people to get to know you a little bit and see what I see, actually.
Sure. Yeah, well, so the short version is I grew up in Minnesota, found my way out west, spent most of the early part of my career in San Francisco. I started as a management consultant at Bain out of college. Great job, great first job out of college, but very quickly realized I did not want to spend the rest of my life as a management consultant. And so being in San Francisco, I got the tech bug and ended up joining early stage startup as their first employee with car sharing startup. So think Airbnb for cars. The company's name was Wheels. We got acquired by Turo. And that was while I was in business school at Stanford. And then I met my wife, Ashley, in business school there, and we spent a few more years in the Bay Area. I had a stint as a venture capitalist at a early stage venture firm called Trinity Ventures on Sand Hill Road. And then we wanted to be closer to family. And so we packed our whole lives up into our Subaru and shipped everything else across the country to Colorado in end of 2015, early 2016 in Colorado for coming up on a decade now, and spent 7 years leading product and growth teams at Ibotta, which is a mobile coupon and rebate app based right here in Denver. I was their first PM and then led their core product team. Then I went to Quizlet, which is where I had the pleasure of working with Ali, and I built their product growth team from the ground up and ultimately ended up leading their subscriptions team as well. And then spent a year at Faire leading all category and international expansion. And then about 18 months ago, and this is sort of relevant to your podcast, and I think a lot of what we'll talk about today, decided I just wanted more time, more freedom, more flexibility to be with my family. You know, I'm a Midwestern guy. And so I wanted to be able to be present as a husband, as a father. And I was just finding that being a senior product leader at a tech company made it hard to do that sometimes. And so I jumped out and started my own growth advising and consulting business. And I've been doing that ever since and loving it.
As you were talking, I wanted to start with asking about a life as a Midwestern. And then you ended on that note, which is interesting. So let me actually start with that. What was it feel like growing up in the Midwest?
Sure. Well, first, I have to show you this. This is my Minnesota Vikings hat. I'm a
There you go.
diehard Vikings fan. I thought about wearing it, but I thought that would be unprofessional. I don't want to make Ali look bad. So I won't wear it. But, part of being a Midwesterner is loving football. That is a big part of living in the Midwest. And I'm a diehard Vikings fan. But outside of that, and all jokes aside, I think obviously we're speaking in generalities, and people are all sorts of different types of people who live on the coast, and there are all sorts of different types of people who live in the middle of the country. But I think the Midwestern ethos is one of family comes first, put your head down and work hard, but work isn't everything in life. And it's important to have balance. It's important to have community. And so what's interesting about my background is I was born in Minnesota, and I spent most of my formative years between about 10 and 18 in Minnesota. But I moved around quite a bit between 1 and 10, and I lived on the East Coast for most of that time. And so I've had exposure to both worlds. And then I went out west after graduating college. And so I guess what I would say is I'm somebody who's always lived with this dichotomy of wanting to belong and feel like I'm part of a community, and I don't need to be the best. I don't need to be the most special. I just want to be part of the group. And that's very much my Midwestern upbringing. But then I also have this very competitive streak of like, I want to stand out and I want to be an A player, and I want other people to, recognize what I'm capable of. And so that can create a lot of tension. And I've spent different chapters of my life in different parts of the country and in different roles that sort of cater to those two different sides of my personality, but they're very different. And, there are pros and cons to both.
Yeah. Is there any specific memory of your childhood? Because I know you mentioned you've been around a lot, and being around, I'm curious in these kind of like moves from one place to another for whatever reason it's been, if you want to share. Um, has there been any specific memory that you think is shaping Phil as the person he is today?
Yeah, I mean, I think more than anything, I have just been very blessed to have a very happy, healthy, supportive, loving family. And so when I think about my childhood, I think it was a fairly typical, maybe less typical these days, but it was a very stable childhood, right? My dad worked hard, but he was usually there for dinner and on weekends and made it to as many of my soccer games as he could. And my mom was an environmental lawyer, but she worked from home and she was always around. And I have one younger brother. And so we just always had this we weren't far from perfect, but, a loving nuclear family. We also stayed very close to my relatives on both sides. So my dad's whole family is from New Jersey. My mom's whole family is from Florida. We'd always go to New Jersey for Thanksgiving to see my dad's relatives, always go to Florida for Christmas to see my mom's relatives. And so more than anything, that was kind of the constant was like, I love my family. I trust my family. I know that no matter what happens in life, no matter how hard I fall, they'll be there to pick me up again. And now, as a father of two daughters, I'm trying to recreate that for them. And that's really, really important to me. And part of that is being a good provider, right? And so I do want to go out into the world and master my craft and make a good living. But I also want to be around. That's the number one gift I can give to Kinley and
Mhm.
Liana, my two daughters, is be present as a father. And navigating that balance is hard, especially in modern America. Like it is not easy.
What are some of the things that you see constantly changing, shifting that balance or impacting that balance for you as someone who's been in this industry for a very long time now?
Yeah. I mean, I want to be careful of not speaking in broad generalities too much, but I think we're all feeling this, right? It's like the pace at which the world is changing just seems to be accelerating faster and faster and faster. And artificial intelligence is just the latest thing that is accelerating that. And so I think what that means is, on the work front, it feels like things just aren't as stable as they were in previous generations, right? I think back to my grandfather on my dad's side, Walt Carter, right? He served in the Korean War, like died in the wool American. And then he came back from the war and he married my grandmom Isabel. And then he went to Campbell's Soup Factory and he worked literally for the rest of his career at Campbell's Soup as a marketer for 50 years. And then he retired and he had a pension and that was it. And he lived in the same neighborhood and the same community in New
Hmm.
Jersey for pretty much his entire adult life. He raised three wonderful children, one of whom is, my father. And he was very good at what he did. And he was able to sort of slowly but steadily build mastery around a career as a marketer over the course of decades. And then, my dad came along and my dad also was in marketing and he had a very different experience where, he was at the top of his field. He went to Harvard Business School. He worked for some great companies, General Mills, American Express, but he moved around a lot more. He worked at half a dozen different companies over the course of his career. His average stint was probably around 4 years or so. And that was pretty typical for his generation. And
Hmm.
now you have our generation. And
Hmm.
especially if you work in tech, it's like, if you work for 2 years at a tech company, that's considered like, wow, you did a good job. You're loyal because things are just moving so fast. And that goes on both sides, right? I think employees are less loyal to their employers than they used to be, and employers are less loyal to their employees than they used to be. And so it's just created a very dynamic environment. And there are positives to that, but it can be
Hmm.
stressful, especially if you have a family.
Within your story, you highlighted some of that, for example, like working at Bain and then shifting to startup scene and then from one startup to another, helping some growing their teams from 0 to 10. But like at the same time, it was that change that we can see. How would you describe these shifts within your career? And if there is a string that connects all of them that you want to share with us?
Sure. I guess I kind of divide my career up into a few chapters. So, chapter one, I would call figuring out who I want to be when I grow up, right? So, come out of college, I went to Bain, which was one of the top consulting firms. And so I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, but my dad was in business. I studied economics. And so management consulting was just one of the things you did if you were interested in business coming out of a good college. And so I went to Bain and I learned a ton. And I'm so grateful for that experience. It really was. Not only was it a great foundational experience to really learn about business and how to show up as a professional and work with a client, but it was also just a lot of fun. I mean, there were a bunch of other early 20 somethings running around San Francisco with me. And, we worked really hard, but we also played hard. And so that was a great experience. Then I went to business school for a couple of years, and I would include that in the same chapter because, like Bain, it was a way of me just like getting that foundation in place, understanding how business works, understanding the different facets of how I could build a career in business, and building some lifelong friendships among people who were also, in some cases, professional colleagues. Then I entered, well, actually, I would add one more piece to that first chapter, and that was the 2.5 years I spent at Trinity Ventures. So went to venture capital out of business school, and very different experience because obviously as a venture capitalist, you're investing in companies. It's not a services business. You're an investor. You're providing services in the form of guidance and mentorship, showing up to board meetings. But more than anything, you're an investor. And so that was like the third stanza in that first chapter of understanding the business world broadly defined and seeing it from a bunch of different angles. Then I got into the second chapter of my career, which coincided with moving from San Francisco to Colorado. And that was really jumping into tech and doing my best to become a competent operator. And so I was fortunate to find Ibotta, which was this up and coming startup in Denver when I moved here. One of the biggest risks of moving from San Francisco to Colorado was I didn't know anyone here. I had no professional network here. And my wife and I literally just decided, like, we're going to do this. We want to be closer to family. We know Colorado is where we want to build our lives. So we don't have jobs, but we're just going to take a leap of faith and make it happen. And we spent 3 months as ski bums, or for me, a snowboard bum. I know you're a fellow snowboarding enthusiast. And we just figured it out. And I ended up landing at Ibotta as their first product manager. And over time, built out their consumer product team. And that was a great experience. I learned a lot, sometimes the hard way, because it was a very steep learning curve, but I kind of figured it out as I went. And then I went to Quizlet and Faire. And so I would bucket those together into chapter 2, which is emerging as a tech product and growth leader. And I loved the work. I mean, it was really intellectually stimulating work, really challenging. Also managing teams was a really exciting and fulfilling component of it. But it was very taxing. I was working 50 plus hour weeks, in some cases 60 to 70 plus hour weeks. And so as we started to have kids, there was this trade-off of like, how do I balance being a great husband and father with being a top tech professional? And that got me to phase 3 of my career, or chapter 3 of my career, which was summer 2023, ended up starting my own growth advising and consulting business. And so now I work full-time with consumer subscription businesses. I've worked with 16 clients since I started it. And at least for the chapter of life I'm in now, I found it's the best of both worlds. I get to tap into all of the mastery and expertise that I worked so hard for 10 years to build in those previous 2 chapters, but now do it as part of my own business on my own schedule. I'm fortunate now that I have enough clients interested in working with me that I get to hand select which clients I'm working with. And so it's just made it much easier to balance the demands of professional life with what I want to be doing as a husband and father.
I love how you split that into chapters, and so much of a Phil Carter of you, just organizing things in a very clean way to share. So I appreciate that. And I think the area that I want to dive into a little bit as the story given this second chapter, which was a lot of like moving pieces within that. So if you want to share a little bit of that story with us, I think that would be great for the audience to hear. That was a lot of like the startup and the growth part and the 10 years that you spent so much time and so much effort to get to where you are today.
Yeah, I think the specific anecdote you're referring to from the Startup Dad podcast I did with Adam was working at Ibotta, to sort of set some context. My wife, Ashley, and I had just moved to Colorado. I had found this job with Ibotta. In hindsight, I was very lucky that I just happened to find such a great company, and they happened to be hiring their first product manager from the outside. There was one other woman, Rossi, who was a great mentor of mine, who had moved over from customer support to product. And so she sort of brought me up, but I was their first product hire. And I didn't know anything about being a product manager. I mean, I'd worked in tech sort of because I was the first employee at this startup in San Francisco, but I wasn't a product manager, and I'd been an investor, but that's very different. And so I just had so much to learn. And fortunately, over the course of my first year, I learned a lot, and I ended up leading one of the largest, up to that point, the largest product launch in the company's history. We completely overhauled their iPhone and Android apps, in part because we were expanding beyond offline grocery rebates, which is where Ibotta had spent all of its time up to that point, into mobile commerce transactions. So renting an Uber or an Airbnb or booking a trip on booking.com, you could earn cash back through Ibotta. And that required a pretty fundamental overhaul of the product experience, which professionally was amazing. I mean, what an outstanding opportunity for somebody 1 year into their product career to be able to take on that level of responsibility. But it coincided with having my first child, Kim. And at the time, Ibotta's policy was you get 1 week of paternity leave. I ended up negotiating for 2 weeks, and they were very gracious about that. And by the way, Ibotta is not alone. This isn't me trying to criticize Ibotta. Like, outside of Silicon Valley, there are a lot of companies, tech included, where you don't get the Google, 6 months of paternity leave. That did come at a cost because I only had so much time at home with my first daughter before I had to go back to work. And it also just so happened we were right in the middle of this big product launch. And so I went back to very long hours and an intense schedule. And all of this worked itself out. Like, it culminated in the product launch was a big success. And, I did my best to sort of make up for lost time with Kinley. But I do think then when I had my second daughter, Liana, I was at Quizlet. Quizlet's one of these Silicon Valley based tech companies. And so in Silicon Valley, it's just kind of the norm that you get a lot more parental leave. And so I got 2 months of paternity leave with Liana. And there was just a material difference in the amount of bonding and connection I was able to get with Liana right out of the gate. And at this point, Kinley's 7 and Liana's 5, and I love them both very much. And I feel equally close and equally bonded with both of them. But it was a little bit of a wake-up call when I was in that chapter, because I don't think I'd fully internalized what a big difference those first precious weeks can make. And so I'm glad that, the policy is shifting more and more, even in the US, which historically hasn't been the best about this, to giving parents a little bit more time.
I'm curious, not having that time in general, like, did it impact your day to day in any way, or did it impact like some of the worries or some of the stress level that you may have experienced during that time, or were you able to kind of like cope with that limitation?
I think I was able to cope with it well enough. And I'll also say, look, I bought his policy was 1 week, and they were very gracious. When I asked for 2 weeks, they instantly gave it to me. I think, I don't know this to be the case, but I think since then they've also changed their policy. Like, I think at this point, Ibotta offers quite a bit more parental leave. And in general, I think tech companies have moved more and more in that direction. But outside of tech, there's still a lot of companies where you don't get any leave in some cases, right? And so I think it's just one of these things that certainly if you haven't had kids, it's hard to fully appreciate the impact of that. But even once you have kids, if you haven't had the experience of both versions of it, it's hard to know what the counterfactual looks like, right? And so if you're somebody who only had a week or two to bond with your child before going back to work, but you did that every time, then that's your experience. Or if you're somebody who is fortunate enough to get multiple months of maternity or paternity leave with every child, then that's your experience, and you don't know the counterfactual. I just happen to have been in a situation where I got both, and so I can compare and contrast the differences a bit more. But as far as what the experience was like with Kinley when I then had to go back to work, at the time I was still in my early 30s. I had a lot of energy. I also have an amazing wife who had several months of maternity leave. And so she was able to sort of be there when I couldn't be. And so I don't remember it as a negative experience, but I do remember it as a very intense experience, and one where like I was basically, parenting, sleeping, and then getting up and going to work, staying there late in some cases, coming home, and then rinsing and repeating, because that's really all I had time for.
And I think fast forward in the third chapter, and I love following the chapters you introduced for us. Going in the third chapter of your life, you decide to kind of like start your own business. Like, what are the things that you think this new chapter would do for you and your family, and how is it going to be balancing what getting you to that balance that you actually need in your life?
Yeah, I think there are a few dimensions to it. So one is flexibility and autonomy. When I first started my growth advising business, I only had 2 or 3 clients. And so I had a lot more time, period. At this point, things have gone well enough that I'm back to working at least 40-hour weeks. In many cases, I'm working 45 or sometimes even 50-hour weeks again. But even then, a 50-hour week running my own business where I call the shots and I have control over my own schedule and I can decide if I want to take on another client or not is very different than a 50-hour week when you are part of a corporate machine and you sort of need to do whatever the business needs you to do in order for everyone to succeed. And by the way, I'm a big believer that that's part of the deal, right? Like it's part of why America has such a strong economy. And there are countries where people work even harder than America. But in general, America is a relatively hardworking culture. And that's part of why there's so much success is because people band together and they roll up their sleeves and they get down to work. But it's not for everyone. And it's not for every chapter. And
Mhm.
I also think that, there are work cultures where people work hard, but it feels like there's a recognition of there needs to be a limit and there needs to be space for people to be able to go home and unwind and not be on the clock all the time, not be on Slack all the time. And I know a lot of what you talk about on your podcast is mental health. I think that's one of the biggest places where people start to suffer is
Mhm.
when it's not so much about the raw number of hours, because there aren't that many companies where people consistently working 60+ hour work weeks, week in and week out. But it's the feeling of even when I'm not working, I can't fully unplug because I know that at any moment I could get a Slack from my boss or someone else I'm working with telling me it's time to jump online and fix something.
Mhm.
And that just didn't used to be the case, right? Before cell phones, maybe you would get a phone call if it was a real emergency, but otherwise you kind of knew that once I'm home and I can just check out, unwind, wake up tomorrow morning and be ready to go in and face another day in the office. And that's just not true anymore. Like we're all connected all the time. And it doesn't just apply to work either. Like I think this is why you have so much mental health issues among teenagers is people are on their cell phones all the time and they're comparing each other all the time. And
Mhm.
so I just don't know that humans are necessarily wired to thrive in that.
Yeah, you kind of answered a question I wanted to ask, which is, or maybe we can still tap into it. I was hoping to ask, we all kind of like get into this corporate environment, and I loved how you say it. There's a phase to it. Like it's there's not necessarily much bad about it. It's a phase. We don't have to do it for our entire life. But for us, I mean, I also experienced that something myself, but in a different way. It soaked my energy and got me so much involved. Even before Quizlet, I was even spending way more time in
Mhm.
my full time job. And we all see it, and it feels cringing a little bit, but we all get into it. And
Yeah.
I was just trying to really understand what is it that it's taking all of us in. And of course, most of us, hopefully, we find a way to kind of like heal or balance it and get out of it. But what is it about it that gets all of our energy in, gets all of us involved? Most of us reply to emails sometimes late time in the day, or Slack, thanks to all the features that they created, that you can now schedule messages. But there used to be no schedule feature. So when you were sending a message, it was gone and causing stress for another person. What is it that is taking all of us in at some point?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of different factors. And also, I'll say right front, like, I'm not an expert, so this is just my 2 cents. But I think it's a few things. One, I think tech in particular is an extremely dynamic ecosystem. And going back to what I said at the beginning of our episode, that's just continuing to accelerate, right? Like, it feels like even in the last 2 years since ChatGPT really exploded onto the scene, it's just going faster and faster. And so I think everybody feels this pressure, some of it real, some of it imagined, that, okay, I got to be on the cutting edge. I need to read every blog post. I need to listen to every podcast. I need to understand how to perfect my prompt engineering in ChatGPT and Claude so I don't become irrelevant. And so that's part of it, is just the macro pressures of being in an industry like tech where everything's constantly changing. I think a second part of it is relates to the individual. And so this isn't unique to tech, although it certainly applies to tech, where it attracts disproportionately highly motivated type A people. And then tech cultures, and I think this is well intentioned, but there's a little bit of like drinking the Kool-Aid in tech, right? Like how many times have you walked into a tech company and, you know, everybody's wearing the same hoodie and everybody's got the same, you know, I've got one right here, your Yeti coffee mug that's branded. And it's a little bit like it's tribalism. And so that creates this feeling of, one, I'm a high achiever and I want to perform. And two, I'm part of this tribe and I want other people in the tribe to know that I am pulling my weight, that they can count on me. And ideally that I'm somebody who is ultimately going to be viewed as a leader or somebody that, you know, other people can depend on or even look up to. And so that creates, some of it's intentional, some of it's unintentional, but that creates this sort of pressure chamber of like everybody constantly feeling like they need to prove themselves and go above and beyond. And then I think the third thing is societal, meaning it just doesn't feel like there is as much of a safety net as there used to be, especially in America. And there are plenty of people who know a lot more about this topic than I do, so I don't want to reveal my ignorance. But like at a high level, even though America is, I believe, the most affluent nation in the history of the world, certainly one of them. I don't know how it relates in terms of like adjusting for inflation and all that. But we live in a very affluent country with a lot of privilege. And yet so many people just feel like they're kind of on the knife's edge where if things don't go the right way, they maybe not out on the street, but like things can get difficult because it's just a very capitalist society. And so I think that's the other piece, is there's just a lot of anxiety, especially among younger generations, around like, how am I going to make it? It's so competitive. There's so many people out there who, everything from like college admission rates, it's gotten so much harder to get into a top Ivy League school, even than it was when I applied, let alone when my parents applied. And then after you work your butt off and you get into a good college or university, if you're fortunate enough to be one of the few who get in, then it just becomes another rat race. And you're trying to get into the prestigious investment bank or consulting firm or law firm or go to med school. And then after that, it's like, now I got to climb the corporate ladder and prove myself. And all of this is good to a degree, right? It's good to be competitive and it's good to strive and to be your best self. But at some point, the costs can just become crushing.
And you also mentioned something earlier about our parents' generation. They used to, like, your grandpa working for 50 years and then your father only working at a couple of companies and shift. And now us just shifting from one another, that kind of like creates this another full circle to this point that you're saying. And I totally agree with you that there is a, by the way, you said you're not an expert, but I think the way you actually have a perspective in this, given how many companies you've seen, how many CEOs you've seen these days. So I appreciate what you shared. But what I'm seeing is also like very similar to what you described, is just like this rat race. You exit one and then you suddenly start another. You think you're done worrying about work, but as soon as you start getting a mortgage, you're in another rat race. Or as soon as you start selling one stock, you have to buy another stock, because why did you sell your stock? Like, it's just like, it's a never ending game. Sure, I get the math of it, but what I want to protect myself, like as an individual, is like how to balance the stress and like the unnecessary stress that I'm going to be taking. What is the cap that I'm going to be maximizing from, let's say, this money that I'm putting in this stock, or this time that I'm putting in this job, or this effort that I'm putting in creating this community? So I think just having that awareness eventually and finding that awareness has been something that helped me. What are some of the things that helped you in this journey to find exactly what you want? I know you're a fellow snowboarder. What are some of the other things? What are some of the other routines or anything that you have created in your life to remind you about this balance that you were talking about?
Yeah, well, I'll do micro and macro. So micro, I'm somebody who, you use the word routines, and my wife teases me about this all the time. understandably so. I'm a creature of habit. And so every weekday I wake up, I go on my run, or I go to the gym, work out 5 days a week, come back, kiss my wife and kids goodbye, hop on the bus. I live in Boulder, so great public transportation system. And so I hop on the bus and I've got like a 20-minute commute from my house into downtown Boulder where I work. And when I'm on the bus, I usually meditate or I read a book or listen to a podcast. And so that's kind of a nice way of easing into the day. And I've already exercised, so I've taken care of physical health. I've meditated, so I've taken care of mental and emotional health. I am a spiritual person. And so in some cases, I'll read the Bible or find a way to tap into the spiritual side of my life, or being outside. Like that's another big way that I find myself drawing spiritual energy, is just being in the mountains or being outside. But I try to really take care of those 4 buckets. And I do that largely through these routines. The macro piece of it is, I guess what I've found is the best way to insulate yourself from what I've heard described as the hedonic treadmill, right? It's like, okay, I got into a great school, but now I need to go to the top job, and then I need to make the highest title, and then I need to make the largest salary, and then I need to buy the largest house. And it's like, it's never enough, right? To me, the best way I've found to insulate against that is to really look within. I'm going to get philosophical for a moment. Marcus Aurelius has this quote. It's maybe my favorite quote of all time. He says, "Look within, for within is the fountain of good, and it will ever bubble up if thou will ever dig." And so what he's saying is like, don't look out into the world for answers on the most important things. Often the most important things, you can only get those answers by digging deep inside your heart and your mind. And so what I've found is like really being honest with myself about what matters most in life. And for me, that's my wife, Ashley. It's my girls, Kenley and Liana. It's my community here in Boulder, and with my family. Like I still go back to Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays to see my family every year. It's the friendships that I've gathered over the years. Silly, but like things like the Vikings, right? I'm a diehard Vikings fan. There's a lot of community that comes in that, right? Snowboarding. So snowboarding is a huge hobby of mine. If there's a big powder day in the winter, I want to be able to take half a day off of work and go up to the mountains and snowboard, because that's really important to me and I draw a lot of energy from it. But at some point, there's only so much time in the day and you only have so much energy. And so if you have these anchors in your life, the things that matter most to you, then it's much easier to shield yourself from the never ending voice in your head of, I need more, I need more, I need more. Because instead of like, I need a bigger title, I need more money, I need a bigger house, it's, I want more time with my family and I want more days in the mountains going snowboarding. If you don't have those anchors that are authentic to you, then you end up just comparing yourself to other people all the time, and there's never any end to it. And I think that's what can lead to filling the void with money or title or status or whatever the case may be. And I think there are very few people who are happy ultimately when that's what their lives get defined by. And I don't think they mean to do it. I think it's just kind of a trap that all of us fall into. I've certainly fallen into it at times in my life.
I love the word that you're sharing with us here, anchor. It's another good trick. I remember one of the times in one of our one-on-ones, we can disclose this. One thing I learned from you, which may seem very simple for the folks who are listening, but you have this idea of like a sacred date night per week.
Mm-hmm.
And you've been mentioning how it's been helping, and I tried it. I recommended it to a lot of my friends, by the way, thanks to you. So if they're listening, this is the Phil Carter guy that I was telling you guys about. So yes, I learned it from you. And once you just said anchor, it made sense to me what I learned from you. And I think it's so important. These are reminders and celebration moments. So if you have enough celebrations in your day, you don't need necessarily another raise to get celebrated. I mean, it would
Yeah.
be great if you get more money on your paycheck. And if it's your right, you should go get it. I'm not against it. But if you have other celebrations in your day, missing one is going to be more easier to manage versus keep losing. I feel like in that rat race, we kind of like define a new set of goals that never existed in our life. We define things that we are not even yearning for. We define things just because we are seeing it and we don't know if they're even our values. We define them as a goal, and by not achieving them, we take them as losses, or we try to get them. We create kind of like this competition for ourselves within, as, hey, I had a win today because in the morning I was able to run for 2 miles again. I did my meditation. I read my Bible again, listened to these two podcasts. Great. And then at the end of the day, I had dinner with my family. That's another win. And those are true, genuine, deep win, given at least the story that we are hearing from you within your story. It makes all the sense. Like, you're such a family oriented person, and those are amazing wins. If a year you miss your Thanksgiving time with your family, I would assume that's a loss. Like, you're like, ah,
Yeah.
I had to make it, right?
Yeah, and that's a year you
Sorry.
can't get back. And I'll even take it one step further, and I will attribute this where attribution is due. So for the longest time, I held off on reading this book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, because it's one of those titles where you're like, this is snake oil. Like, it just sounds so hokey.
Clickbait.
But I heard enough people tell me, like, you got to read this book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective. And it's such a good book. I mean, it's been out for decades now, but it's such a good book. And one of the things the author talks about is this idea of production versus production capacity. And production
Hmm.
is basically energy you're spending to impact the world, or to make more money, or get a raise, or pursue things in the world, right? Production capacity is your internal store of energy and creativity and inspiration and love and joy. And if you burn too hot for too long, you'll maximize your production in the short term, but you'll burn out your productive capacity. So the real secret, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you I've got it figured out, but I'm trying, like, I'm very much orienting my life, or trying to, in a way where the things that drive production capacity are sacred. So time with my family, time in the outdoors,
Hmm.
exercise, meditation, getting out snowboarding at least, 10, 20 days a year. Those things fill up my stores of energy, love, joy, creativity, which means that in the long run, I may actually have more career success than if I was so laser focused on getting to that next raise, getting to that
Hmm.
next promotion as quickly as possible. And that's certainly what I'm finding with this advising business. Like, I never set out. I assumed that when I left the corporate ladder, I would have to give up financial security to a degree, or make less money. If anything, I'm finding that the opposite is true. And so when you do what you love and you protect the things that really energize you, you do better work, and you end up more successful in the long run anyways.
Indeed. That that's awesome. And this, what you were saying, the way I understood it is, it's not just a celebration. Those are actually where you get your energy to make things possible. So that's why they become actually necessary in your day to day. So they're not just a habit to get you going. They are the source now. Like,
Yeah,
spending that time with family becomes the source for you to go get whatever you need outside.
absolutely. Yeah. And there are cases, I mean, you mentioned date night, and it means so much to me that you brought that up, because this is something that has just been so central to my marriage. And, we just celebrated 10 years of marriage a couple months ago. We ended up
Congratulations.
going on a trip to Peru, which, by the way, anybody who hasn't been to Peru, it's one of the most amazing places I've ever seen in my life. But part of the reason our marriage is stronger than ever is because we have this heartbeat every week of, every once in a while we'll miss one, but almost every week we go out on a date night. Usually it's on Thursdays. And, sometimes it's super romantic, and other times we're just sort of comparing notes, or we're supporting each other because somebody's going through a hard time. But having that consistent heartbeat in our marriage is so powerful. And so that is not only intrinsically enjoyable, but also it's essential for me to feel like my healthy, full, best version of myself, which from a purely practical standpoint also has benefits, because when I go into the work on Friday morning, I feel fully energized and ready to take on the day, and then go into the next week with a full head of steam.
Phil, this was so great. And I really appreciate you and your time, as we are trying to respect your time, because I know we have a hard stuff for your next meetup. I'm leaving you with this last question. If there's anything that you would like to be sharing with our audience, where they can find you, if you have a project that's exciting that's coming up that you want them to take a look, anything that you want to leave us with.
The reason I love your podcast so much, Ali, is because it's not a professional podcast. It's about life, not work. And we obsess too much about work sometimes. So I do have a website. It's philgcarter.com. If anybody's interested in the work that I do or needs a growth advisor, you can feel free to check out my website. But I'd rather actually take this opportunity to mention my wife's organization. So my wife has a nonprofit called Daring Girls that she started when she was 16, believe it or not.
Wow.
It's based in Tanzania. It has now expanded into other parts of Eastern Africa. And it's all about empowering young women, usually teenagers who are right at that formative part of their lives where, in many cases, they're not able to continue their education or they're having to drop out of secondary school in order to help out at home. And so Daring Girls it's impacted at this point tens of thousands of girls across East Africa. They've gotten a UN grant. And so if you are interested in making an impact in that part of the world, it's a great organization. You can go to daringgirls.org and every little bit counts. Donations of like $20 are enough to provide lunches and school supplies to these girls. And so that's what I'd like to leave everyone with.
That's amazing. And that reminds me that I always wanted and love to chat with her. And it would be amazing to have her on the show as well. We will also leave the link into the show notes for folks to go in and definitely support this amazing cause. Thank you so much for
Thanks.
bringing that to the show. And thank you for bringing your story to the show, Phil. I know, as you mentioned, this is not like a typical podcast that you would be showing up on, but I appreciate your openness and I appreciate all the great structured thoughts and stories that you shared with us today. I'm not surprised, but I enjoyed it again.
Of course. It's such a pleasure. And I miss you, Ali. So this was a good opportunity to reconnect.
Indeed. And hopefully next time I'll see you in Boulder, somewhere around there for snowboarding.
Yeah.
All right, man.
You owe me another snowboarding weekend.
I owe you,
All right.
buddy. All right, man. Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Ali.
Have a wonderful day. Bye bye.
You too.